Mike, my first question has to deal with the idea of hate speech being regulated within this context. How would you propose that the government regulate hate speech?
Well, there are already many institutions or instances right now that we can see that people are already limiting hate speech. For instance, here at SIU, we already have a code of conduct that limits the types of insightful, hateful rhetoric. Or my argument, rather, is simple. It is just a definition-based law. It is to say that there is a type of context that we can view rhetoric, and one that views it through a lens of trying to incite violence or trying to disturb the peace naturally is a hate speech.
Now, Mike, to me that seems rather subjective, but how is an objective way of defining what hate speech is and what hate speech is not?
I'm not sure that there could be anything we could truly determine objectively. I tend to think that we should always sort of bring our opinions into things and understand how we can orient ourselves within larger systems. But if we are to truly believe and have full faith in the Constitution that it should protect us from hate speech already, I tend to think that we should have full faith in our government as well, and they should be able to understand the types of speech that have been violated.
Right. Now let's talk about this within the context of the government. Your reading of the First Amendment says that the Congress shall make no law restricting the freedom of speech. Is that not correct?
It's close to that. It's abridging, but
okay.
Yes.
But within that context, wouldn't it seem that the policing of speech, saying that individuals cannot say certain words, would, in this context, be unconstitutional because it is abridging freedom of speech?
That's pretty interesting. It has been noted the Constitution is a living document. It's supposed to illustrate flexibility. There was a time when, yes, we wrote the Constitution, but we also owned slaves at the same time. The Constitution was meant to evolve, to adapt to our exploring social circles.
Now, I'm glad that I could teach you what a living document was last weekend, Mike, but how do you feel about the 2011 Supreme Court case of Snyder versus Phelps that upheld it that hate speech is ultimately available via the First Amendment?
I'm not sure that that particular court case upholds that hate speech is available via the First Amendment. However, there are fundamental rights to individuals to be able to petition in specific venues. They would indicate in this instance that Phelps is within his right to continue petitioning specific funerals around the United States. But the question here today is not what the Supreme Court has ruled on previously. The question here today is whether or not there is an implication on allowing hate speech to continue. It is not guaranteed the Supreme Court had it right before, but we can remedy those situations now.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Fantastic speech. Emeritus professor of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Noam Chomsky, once said that if we don't believe in freedom of expression for people we despise, we don't believe in it at all. It is because I agree with this quote by the father of modern linguistics that I stand in firm opposition of today's resolution that states resolved. Hate speech should not be protected under the First Amendment. For the sake of argument, I would like to propose a couple of definitions. The first of which being free speech. The freedom of speech is the freedom and ability of speak without the censorship or limitation. The second argument being the marketplace of ideas, which is the rationale of freedom for expression based on an analogy of the true economic concept of the free market. The very thesis of my argument is that you cannot have good speech without bad speech. For free speech to exist, you must in effect embrace it all. I will first start with my offense, or my best arguments, which will make the 99 Rams look like a Pee-wee team. Then we will go to my defense, or answering Mike's arguments, which the 85 Bears would be pretty proud of. My first argument is that in order for free speech to exist, you must embrace hate speech. In order to truly protect speech, you must protect all speech. A failure to protect hate speech would ultimately cause a slippery slope that would allow the government to regulate other forms of speech as well. The alternative to protection of all speech is a slippery slope that ultimately allows for the restriction of speech elsewhere. In fact, philosopher David Hume said it best that it is seldom that any kind of liberty is lost all at once. It goes on to talk about how in the Toledo Law Review, Sylvester Petro of Wake Forest said, thus it is unacceptable to say that the invasion of one aspect of freedom is of no import because there have been so many invasions of other aspects. That road leads to chaos, tyranny, despotism, and the end of all human aspiration. What this argument fundamentally says is that whenever we give the government the ability to regulate one form of speech, it ultimately gives them the ability to regulate other areas of our social life as well. Now that we have established that hate speech should be protected as free speech, it's important to truly know how crucial free speech is to the American democracy. My second point is that free speech is essential to the overall health of the American political system, and that ultimately hate speech has been protected by the Constitution. In March, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutional right of people to exercise hate speech as free speech in the case of Snyder versus Phelps. The case drew massive amounts of national attention as it rotated around the idea of the Westboro Baptist Church. Now, many of us are ultimately opposed to the Westboro Baptist Church because they hold up absolutely ludicrous signs, which I will talk about later actually being quite productive to movements. However, even here in Illinois, an issue that strikes close to the Skokie decision, the Supreme Court said in this instance it upheld the First Amendment right of the National Socialist Party to march in Skokie, Illinois. Within this context, we see that even close to home, the Supreme Court is upholding the right to free speech, and even if that is hate speech, within the context of the United States. Even one step further, in Virginia versus Black, the court found that the Virginia statute against cross-burning is unconstitutional. But cross-burning done in an attempt to intimidate can be limited as such an expression as long as the pernicious history of the signal of impending violence. Now, what this argument says is that there is indeed a distinction between hate speech and fighting words within that context. If we were to try to completely eliminate hate speech from the Constitution, it would be a reason as why we wouldn't necessarily be allowing fighting words to exist within the Constitution as well. In fact, it's important to note a quote by a Chicago native, Justice John Paul Stevens, in which he says that free speech is essential to democracy. He says specifically that as a matter of constitutional tradition, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, we presume that government regulation of the content of speech is more likely to interfere with the free exchange of ideas than to encourage it. The interest in encouraging freedom of expression in a democratic society outweighs any theoretical yet unproven benefit to censorship. Now, what Justice John Paul Stevens says within this context is that there are really no proven benefits of limiting speech. However, we have seen for the past 200 years the proven benefits of allowing free speech to exist. And as we can tell, hate speech is good in that it ultimately allows democracy to continue. However, it's important to note an additional benefit. My third and final point is that hate speech is productive discourse that can actually be effective for movements of minority groups. The ultimate argument within this is an example that draws upon the case of Snyder versus Phelps within this context. Fred Phelps in the Westboro Baptist Church's negative discourse actually helps the LGBTQ community. I have a close personal friend of mine who asked me to make this argument specifically. He says that for every time the Westboro Baptist Church goes out and has a protest, for every nasty sign that Fred Phelps holds up, are another 5, 10, 15 people that come up to him and say that they ultimately see how negative that sort of hate speech is and how negative the Phelps' language is and ultimately come to his side within this context. The idea is that the enemy of an enemy is my friend. And ultimately, by seeing upon that, we can see that that hate speech can ultimately be extremely productive in alternate causes. However, it's also important to note a simple case that was very, very effective in the 1960s. The following argument is specifically followed by the ACLU. The American Civil Liberties Union has an idea that in order to combat hate speech, we have to allow for more free speech to occur. That the only way we can actually overcome these negative attitudes is to allow for more speech to flourish. Their argument is that within this context, the same laws that are used to protect free speech and the same laws that would be used to punish people who commit hate speech would be the exact same laws that would be used to prosecute protesters and people who are activists within social movements. So it's important to note that in order for democracy to truly occur, and in order for the negative implications of hate speech to be able to be solved for, it's important that we allow all speech to exist. Now let's move on to my opponent's arguments and talk specifically about his offense that was probably worse than Notre Dame's last weekend. His first argument is specifically about why hate speech stifles speech innovation, that ultimately we need to allow for a marketplace of ideas. However, my opponent fundamentally states that anti-government rhetoric should be found unconstitutional and that we should ultimately abolish it within this context. However, something to keep in mind is that if we don't have the ability to speak out against the government, if that is something that is classified as hate speech, then it seems absolutely essential to note that democracy probably could not flourish within such an environment when we were not allowed to speak out against the incumbents. Additionally, it's a reason as to why the government should be representative of the people. If the government is not representative of the people, then we should have the ability to speak out. Now, moving on to his contention 2, in which he says that hate speech ultimately decreases democracy. I have a couple of responses. The first of which is that free speech is absolutely essential to challenging institutional racism. The idea is that you can remember back to my arguments from the American Civil Liberties Union. The only way to confront institutional racism is through protest and through activism. Protest and activism cannot occur in a world in which speech is limited. If we allow for the limiting of speech, We ultimately allow for the limiting of protest and the activism movements that are essential to solving the problems of our society. My opponent goes on to talk about Dick Gregory, an individual who was specifically struck by the ills of racism at Southern Illinois University. However, you can note through this example that things have certainly gotten better. And things have probably gotten better as a result of free and open discourse. The ability of Martin Luther King Jr. to protest and these civil disobedience movements would not exist in a world in which speech was limited, because the laws that would be used to focus in on people who are committing acts of hate speech, those same laws would apply to individuals who are protesting and ultimately being activists in this instance. So it's important to note that in order for this American democracy to work, and in order for the experiments of America to be successful, that we do not limit speech and that we allow free speech and democracy to flourish. Thank you.
First, Ben, I'd like to ask if you've ever been subject to beardism.
So beardism?
Yeah, beardism. The ideological disposition to hate or subjugate individuals with large beards.
Actually, more than you could ever be aware of. I constantly get mistaken for Zach Galifianakis or Jonah Hill. It's awful.
Awful.
Yeah.
But beardism should be protected by the United States Constitution.
Certainly.
Why?
Because an individual has the right to express that opinion, and in order for me to be able to counter such an opinion or speak my mind, the freedom of speech has to, in totality, be protected.
Interesting. You think it's better for democracy for individuals to feel awful, as you said, and not be able to participate?
I think that's probably a bad instance, but something that is an inevitability within our culture. There are bad people. My argument is the only way for us to counter those bad people is to allow more speech to ultimately counter those bad people.
Oh, we should let the bad happen so much that eventually we can't tell the good anymore, right?
No, that is not my argument at all. In fact, the American Civil Liberties Union is on my side, so that's probably a reason why I would be able to win that argument. But also a reason as to why the laws that would be used to prosecute the hate mongers would also be used to prosecute the activists. That is undeniable and that is crucial.
Right, that's interesting. Ben,
It is.
Do you feel as if we live in tyranny right now?
Probably not.
Probably not. But you cite a couple of examples in which the United States Supreme Court has already limited the ability of individuals to assemble or to burn crosses in specific instances. So how can you say that there is actually a slippery slope to collapsing our government if empirically you're on the wrong side?
I mean, I think it seems a little ridiculous to think that one instance of government restriction of rights will completely lead to a totalitarian state. That's probably a sophomoric understanding of my argument.
But isn't that what Sylvester Petro actually says in this report?
No, his argument is more an indication that whenever we allow for one of these policies to occur, it ultimately justifies the payment of other of these or more of these policies to occur. So it's not necessarily that it is definite, but it is far more likely that such a restriction would occur in the future.
Okay. I have one last question.
Okay.
I'm curious, how, if I'm just an individual standing on the sidelines of a street, can I tell the cross is being burned violently against me, or just for the fun and entertainment of an individual?
I mean, obviously the Virginia v. Black example, which I assume you're talking about, is obviously one that is something of a moral gray area. But my argument is within this context that the burning of a cross is something that is generally associated with a movement of fear, and that those sort of things can be restricted. However, if it's for maybe a secular purpose, then it's something that should be protected.
Interesting. Thanks, Ben. Great speech. Ben discusses football in his speech. But the interesting thing about football is what happens on the field. Hate speech happens on the field. You know what else happens on the field? Injuries. One of my favorite players from Kansas City, Eric Berry, is out with a torn ACL as of right now, largely because of the animosity that can be grown throughout players and teams because of hate speech. It is that very same type of animosity that I'm discussing here today. One that should be stopped by the First Amendment because it fosters the very same type of animosity. Now, it might seem playful when we see it on the field, but it is not playful when we see it in our social circles.